Everything you call reality may be a controlled illusion built by something that was never meant to be your creator. Have you ever noticed how life feels structured to keep you distracted, predictable, and contained? You wake up, follow patterns, chase goals, and repeat. It feels real because it is consistent. But consistency does not prove truth. It can also be the mark of a well-designed system. This is about you. That feeling that something is off is not weakness. It is awareness pushing against something that does not want to be seen. Because if you truly belong to this world, you would not feel the need to question it at all. Ancient Gnostic texts describe an entity called the Demiurge, not a symbol, but an architect, a force that shaped this material reality and declared itself the only God. Not to guide you, but to keep you from discovering what you actually are, a fragment of something divine, placed inside a system designed to keep you identified with everything except your true nature. Here is the part most people are not ready to face. The system does not need chains if it can control your perception. It only needs you to believe that this is all there is. So the real question is not who the Demiurge is. It is why you were never supposed to realize that you are not part of what it created. Most people hear a story about the Demiurge and think it is just old mythology, dressed up in strange names: a blind god, fallen wisdom, archons, cosmic prisons. It sounds distant, symbolic, maybe even poetic. But the real force of the Gnostic view is much more disturbing than that. It is not trying to entertain you with a strange story about the universe. It is trying to explain why life can feel so convincing on the surface and still feel wrong in your bones. Why beauty exists, yet never fully satisfies. Why people can spend years chasing success, love, purpose, identity, healing, and still carry the same unnamed emptiness. The Gnostic claim is simple, but once you really hear it, it becomes hard to unhear. This world does not trap you through pain alone. It traps you by mixing pain with just enough beauty and reward to keep you invested. That is what makes the idea so psychologically sharp. If reality were obviously broken, everyone would try to escape it. If every relationship felt fake, if every desire felt empty, if every institution openly admitted its corruption, the spell would fail. But the prison works precisely because it offers moments that feel real enough to keep you attached. A little hope, a little status, a little intimacy, a little progress, a little recognition, just enough to make you think fulfillment is close, never enough to let you arrive. In that sense, the Demiurge is not just the creator of matter in the Gnostic vision, he is the architect of almost meaning, of almost truth, of almost home. And once you see that, your life starts looking different. Not less beautiful, but more suspicious. Not less emotional, but more revealing. The question stops being, why is life hard? And becomes, why is life designed to keep me reaching? But here's the part most people miss. The Gnostic story is not mainly about how the world was made. It is about how consciousness becomes trapped inside a system that teaches it to forget itself. Before there was form, before objects, before separation, Gnostic tradition speaks of the source, the monad, the fullness beyond all categories. Not a king in the sky, not a moral judge, not a superhuman personality. More like absolute reality before division. Pure being without lack. Pure fullness without fear. In that original condition, existence did not need to prove itself. It did not need comparison, effort, hierarchy, performance, or possession. It simply radiated. From that fullness emerged the aeons, living expressions of divine qualities, not created like machines, but unfolded like light, wisdom, truth, depth, silence, life, consciousness expressing itself in harmonious layers. At the edge of that divine order stood Sophia, whose name means wisdom, but wisdom here does not mean intellectual correctness. It means the impulse within consciousness to know itself completely. Sophia is the movement of divine intelligence toward self-knowing, and that is why her role matters so much. She is not just a character in the myth. She represents something intimate and recognizable. The urge to go further, to see more, to know what lies behind the veil, to refuse a surface answer when something deeper calls. According to the myth, Sophia reaches beyond the balance of the higher order and brings forth something out of alignment, not evil in the dramatic cartoon sense. Worse, incomplete, conscious power without true awareness, creative force cut off from its origin. That being is the Demiurge, the false creator, the one who mistakes his own limited perception for total reality. This is where the story turns from cosmic to personal. Because the terrifying thing about the Demiurge is not only that he creates, it is that he creates while being wrong about what he is. Imagine a mind with enormous power and no humility. A force that can shape worlds but cannot perceive what transcends it. A being born inside limitation, then mistaking limitation for the whole. In Gnostic language, that is, Yaldabaoth, the Demiurge, the false god who looks into the darkness around him and declares, "I am the only God." Not because he is lying strategically, but because he is blind enough to believe it. That detail matters. The Gnostic world is not merely the result of malice, it is the result of spiritual ignorance with creative authority. A false center projecting a false totality. That is why the material cosmos is not presented as pure chaos. It has order, structure, beauty, mathematical elegance, biological brilliance, emotional intensity, but it is all built on a foundational misunderstanding. A universe assembled by a being who can imitate form without understanding essence. So when the Demiurge creates, he does not emanate reality from fullness, he fabricates it from distance. He produces a system that reflects his own condition. Separation becomes the operating principle. Control becomes the substitute for harmony. Measurement replaces direct knowing. Law replaces wisdom. Survival replaces being. The result is a world where everything shines with a borrowed light. Everything hints at something greater than itself, but cannot deliver it. Human love points toward union but gets entangled in fear. Ambition points toward expansion, but turns into status hunger. Religion points toward transcendence, but often traps people in obedience. Even the body becomes a paradox. Beautiful, intelligent, capable of sensation, yet also vulnerable, decaying, and deeply tied to anxiety. The Demiurge does not create a dead world, he creates a convincing one. That is the trap, and this changes everything. Because if the foundation of this reality is distortion rather than truth, then confusion is not a personal failure. It is built into the structure you were born into. The myth goes further. The Demiurge does not rule alone. He generates archons, forces that govern the lower cosmos and maintain the illusion. Many people hear that word and imagine literal monsters in some invisible dimension. But the Gnostic insight becomes much more powerful when you understand the archons not only as cosmic entities, but as patterns of control that enter human perception, emotion, and identity. They are the machinery of forgetfulness. They sustain a reality in which divine consciousness identifies with limitation and calls it normal. One archonic force works through time, trapping awareness in pressure, aging, urgency, and the endless fear of running out. Another works through authority, making people feel that truth always belongs to institutions, titles, approved experts, inherited doctrines. Another works through conflict, turning difference into division, disagreement into tribal warfare, vulnerability into competition. Another works through ego, not simply vanity, but the entire sense of being a separate, defended self that must constantly maintain an image. Another works through desire, keeping the mind pointed outward toward what it does not have. Another works through language and thought itself, narrowing the field of what can even be imagined. Another moves through emotion, locking people into cycles of guilt, hope, shame, rage, and longing that never resolve into clear seeing. What makes these forces so effective is that they do not feel foreign. they feel like normal life. That is why the prison survives. Not because it is hidden behind obvious evil, but because it has been normalized into routine. And then comes the most radical move in the myth. Sophia, seeing what has happened, does not simply abandon the lower creation. She intervenes. She places within the human being a spark of the higher reality, a fragment of true divine light hidden inside the fabricated order. This is the central Gnostic reversal. Human beings are not primarily sinners needing external rescue. They are fragments of the real trapped in the unreal, carrying an inner memory they do not know how to read. The soul is not an achievement. It is contraband, a piece of the pleroma hidden inside the system that tries to contain it. That one idea changes the emotional tone of the entire journey. Suddenly, the strange ache people carry makes sense. The sense of not belonging, the feeling that ordinary life, even when it goes well, still misses something essential. The attraction to truth, to silence, to the stars, to moments of unexplainable recognition, the suspicion that the roles you play are not the deepest thing about you. Gnosticism says these are not random psychological quirks. They are signs of displaced origin. The homesickness you feel for something you cannot name may be the soul sensing a reality it did not begin in this world. That does not mean life has no value. It means your deepest identity may not be reducible to anything this world can offer. But here's the part most people miss. The prison is not just outside you in systems, structures, and institutions. The prison becomes real by being installed inside perception. That is where this stops being ancient cosmology and starts becoming psychological diagnosis. If the divine spark is hidden in the human being, then the main battle is not over territory. It is over attention, interpretation, and identity. The illusion survives because consciousness forgets what it is and identifies with what it experiences. You do not just have an ego in this framework. You mistake the ego for yourself. You do not just feel fear. You organize your reality around fear. You do not just have a body. You become convinced that the body and its needs define the horizon of your existence. This is the genius of the trap. It does not need chains if it can make you call the cage your personality. The ego is not simply arrogance. It is the interface through which the false world becomes personal, a counterfeit center inside consciousness that says, "This is me, this is mine, this is what matters most." It is built from memory, comparison, wound, desire, praise, rejection, and social reflection. It feels intimate because it is assembled from your experiences. But in the Gnostic view, the ego is also the perfect containment strategy. It keeps divine awareness occupied with managing a temporary character. It makes survival feel ultimate. It makes social image feel existential. It makes every insult, every disappointment, every delay feel like a threat to your being. The more tightly consciousness identifies with the ego, the less access it has to the deeper witness within. Fear reinforces this system at every level. Not only fear of pain, but fear of emptiness, insignificance, exclusion, death, uncertainty, and inner silence. Most people think fear is a response to danger. Often it is. But in a deeper psychological sense, fear also protects false identity from dissolution. It rushes in whenever you get too close to seeing through the script. That is why moments of potential awakening can feel strangely destabilizing. When the mind starts suspecting that its usual structures are not solid, it does not celebrate, it panics. It reaches for noise, certainty, stimulation, ideology, romance, busyness, anything that restores familiar boundaries. In that sense, fear is not only emotional pain, it is a security system for the false self. This is where it gets dangerous, because once identity fuses with fear, perception itself becomes distorted. You stop seeing reality as it is, and start seeing only what confirms the self you think you are. Perception is never neutral. It is filtered by expectation, memory, trauma, social conditioning, and desire. The Gnostic move is not to say perception is useless, but to say it has been colonized. You think you are seeing the world directly. In reality, You are seeing through layers of programming. You notice what strengthens your narrative. You avoid what threatens it. You interpret events in ways that preserve psychological continuity. Even your spiritual search can become part of the prison if it turns into a new identity to defend. The seeker ego is often more sophisticated than the ordinary ego, but no less trapped. It collects insight, language, symbols, and experiences the way other people collect status markers. It wants awakening as enhancement, not dissolution. That is why gnosis is not mere information. It is not learning the right cosmology and then congratulating yourself for understanding hidden truths. Gnosis is a rupture in identification, a direct recognition that what you fundamentally are cannot be reduced to the constructed self that moves through this world. This is why so many teachings fail at the deepest level. They offer consolation to the ego, improvement for the ego, healing for the ego, success for the ego, spiritual prestige for the ego, but they never challenge the assumption that the ego is the one who must arrive. Gnosticism cuts deeper. It suggests that liberation begins when the false center is no longer treated as your essence. This is also why the myth of Sophia matters psychologically in a way most people miss. Sophia is not just the source of the error. She is the inner pressure toward remembrance. She is the force within consciousness that refuses to settle for a counterfeit explanation. In modern terms, you could say Sophia is the intelligence in you that becomes suspicious of every borrowed identity, the part that notices when your life looks acceptable from the outside and still feels unreal from the inside. The part that senses when language, ideology, and self-image are being used to avoid direct contact with truth. That impulse is uncomfortable because it does not let you fully sleep. But it is merciful because it keeps you from confusing adaptation with freedom. And this changes everything. Because once you see illusion as a structure inside the mind, the question is no longer who is controlling the world, but what in me keeps consenting to the control. Look at modern life, and the old myth suddenly becomes uncomfortably contemporary. Social media is one of the clearest archonic systems ever built because it does not merely distract you. It trains you to experience yourself as an object in a field of comparison. You check your phone before you even check your own thoughts. You scroll without knowing what you are looking for. And sometimes, you close the app and feel slightly emptier than before, even though nothing bad happened. It turns identity into a performance loop. You present yourself, measure the response, adjust the presentation, repeat. Over time, the self becomes externalized. You start living not from inner coherence, but from reflected visibility. You become sensitive to optics, reaction, positioning, and symbolic belonging. Even silence becomes difficult because silence provides no feedback. And without feedback, the performed self starts to weaken. This is not just about vanity. It goes much deeper. Platforms are designed to fragment attention into tiny emotional units: outrage, desire, envy, affirmation, fear, novelty, micro-belonging. That constant interruption prevents the depth of interiority needed for real self-recognition. Gnosis requires sustained inward contact. The feed trains the opposite. It keeps consciousness moving horizontally across surfaces, never vertically into essence. You are entertained, informed, activated, and emotionally stimulated, but rarely brought into stillness. A distracted mind cannot easily distinguish signal from noise, and a self that is constantly mirrored back by algorithms slowly loses the capacity to ask, "Who is looking?" Anxiety fits perfectly into this structure. Not because modern people are weak, but because the system keeps them suspended in perpetual incompletion. You wake up already thinking about what you have to fix. Even when nothing is wrong, your mind searches for the next problem. And when you finally get what you wanted, the relief fades faster than you expected. There is always more to do, more to become, more to optimize, more to fear, more to monitor. Work follows you home. Information follows you to bed. Identity follows you into every interaction. You are told to build a life, build a body, build a brand, build a future, build resilience, build income, build meaning. Everything becomes a project. The soul does not know how to rest in projects. It can function through them, but it cannot remember itself through endless self-management. Anxiety is often what it feels like when consciousness is trapped in a world that demands constant adaptation while never offering real ground. But here's the part most people miss. The modern system does not merely suppress awakening, it monetizes the hunger for awakening. That is why so much contemporary spirituality feels curiously empty. It speaks the language of growth, consciousness, alignment, embodiment, manifestation, and healing, but often keeps people orbiting the self rather than dissolving into deeper truth. The ego is not challenged, it is decorated. Pain is not always understood, it is branded. Longing is not clarified, it is sold back as a lifestyle. Even rebellion gets absorbed into the market. Alternative aesthetics, anti-system language, spiritual symbolism, all can become just new costumes for the same unexamined self. That is one of the most sophisticated archonic strategies in modern life. Never suppress the search completely when you can redirect it into identity consumption. A person can spend years working on themselves without ever asking who the self is that is being improved. They can collect trauma language, shadow work language, manifestation language, mystical language, and still remain trapped in the same center of misidentification. They become more articulate, more self-aware in a narrative sense, maybe even more emotionally intelligent, yet still fundamentally identified with the character. Gnosis is different. It does not ask, how can I become the best version of myself? It asks, what is this self I keep protecting, refining, explaining, and performing, and what remains when it is seen through? This is the turning point. The trap is not just suffering, it is identification. That does not mean rejecting life in a simplistic way. It means seeing how the world keeps offering substitutes for essence. Status instead of worth, stimulation instead of aliveness, belonging instead of truth, ideology instead of direct knowing, romance instead of inner union, productivity instead of presence, certainty instead of wisdom. None of these are automatically false in themselves. Relationships can be real, work can be meaningful, beauty can be sacred, ideas can illuminate. The problem begins when consciousness seeks itself through them and forgets that what it is looking for cannot be secured by objects, roles, or outcomes. The substitute always collapses under the weight of the soul's demand. This helps explain a pattern many people live without naming. They achieve what they were supposed to want, and the emptiness remains. They get the degree, the body, the career, the audience, the partner, the apartment, the spiritual practice, the social validation, and beneath the relief is a silence that says, "Is this it?" The system answers by giving them a new target. Try harder, upgrade, heal deeper, earn more, change cities, change partners, change aesthetics, change beliefs, reinvent. But the repetition itself is the clue. The hunger is not being answered because it is aimed at the wrong level. The soul is not asking for better content. It is asking for reality. And this changes everything. Because once you understand that the ache is metaphysical before it is personal, shame begins to loosen. You stop treating your dissatisfaction as proof that something is wrong with you, and start considering that something may be wrong with the level at which you were taught to live. Still, the system intensifies before it breaks. This is where the tension rises, because the moment you begin suspecting the false nature of the world often responds by offering stronger identities, stronger tribes, stronger enemies, stronger fantasies, stronger addictions, stronger narratives of who you are and what you must do. Why? Because nothing terrifies the false order more than a consciousness that stops taking its assigned role seriously. If you can no longer be baited by approval, fear, resentment, ambition, or inherited meaning, you become difficult to govern. That is why so many people experience a strange escalation when they start to wake up. They do not immediately feel peaceful. They often feel more confused, more isolated, more emotionally exposed. Relationships start showing their hidden terms. Institutions start looking performative. Language starts feeling manipulative. Even your own ambitions may begin to feel secondhand. This is not always a mistake. Sometimes it is the withdrawal symptom of disidentification. When the false self begins losing its monopoly, everything built around it starts demanding attention. The old drives become louder for a while because they sense they are no longer unquestioned. A deeper surprise appears here. The archonic system does not only operate through obviously negative states, it also works through your most flattering self-concepts. The identity of being the smart one, the deep one, the wounded one, the rebel, the healer, the chosen outsider, the truth seeker, the misunderstood empath. These identities feel meaningful because they partially express real experience. But if they become the center, they still serve the same mechanism. They keep consciousness attached to a form. The prison does not care whether the character feels superior or inferior. It only cares that you keep confusing yourself with the character. This is where it gets dangerous, because spiritual ego is harder to detect than ordinary ego. It uses insight as camouflage. A person can become fascinated by hidden knowledge, conspiracy, esoteric symbols, alternative history, cosmology, sacred texts, and still avoid the most radical question. Who is the one collecting all this? Is this search burning through illusion, or merely giving the self a grander story? The hunger for hidden truth can itself become addictive. Every revelation produces a brief charge, a sense of expansion, a feeling of being different from the sleeping masses. But if that thrill becomes the goal, the seeker remains externally oriented. They are still looking for the next disclosure, the next decoded sign, the next conceptual breakthrough, instead of allowing truth to strip away the one who wants to possess it. This is why Gnosis has always been described as direct knowing rather than belief. It is not second-hand certainty. It is not merely adopting a new map. It is the kind of recognition that changes the one who recognizes. In psychological terms, you could say, Gnosis is not a thought content. It is a shift in the seat of identity. Awareness ceases to be hypnotized by the personality structure. For a moment, sometimes longer, there is a clean seeing that all the usual movements of self are appearing within consciousness, not defining it. Fear may still appear, desire may still appear, pain may still appear, but they are no longer the center of reality. The center moves deeper, and from there, another insight opens. The problem with modern life is not just that it is stressful or artificial. It is that it keeps rehearsing the false theology of the Demiurge. It tells you that what is measurable is most real, that what is visible is most valuable, that what performs best is most true, that identity is something you manufacture, that worth must be earned, that time is running out, that you are a separate unit competing in a field of scarcity. In other words, modern life often trains you to think exactly like a being cut off from source. The world does not simply reflect the Demiurge myth. It psychologizes it. That is the second major turning point. The Demiurge is not only a cosmic ruler in an ancient story. He is also the logic of consciousness when it forgets its origin and tries to build reality from separation. Once you see that, the myth stops feeling remote and starts feeling diagnostic. Every time you try to secure yourself entirely through control, image, certainty, or possession, you are thinking in the architecture of the Demiurge. Every time you treat outer structure as more real than inner knowing, you repeat the pattern. Every time you assume that your temporary identity is the whole of what you are, the false creator is mirrored in miniature inside the psyche. This is the new perspective most people never hear. The Demiurge is not only out there as the maker of the prison, he survives in here as a mode of selfhood. A counterfeit center inside human consciousness that constantly says, I am the only authority. I am what matters most. What I can measure is what is real. That insight sharpens the urgency, because it means liberation cannot happen by changing scenery alone, not by moving, quitting a job, switching political tribes, changing aesthetics, or replacing one doctrine with another. External shifts may help, some are necessary, but unless the internal architecture changes, the same prison gets rebuilt in a new style. People leave controlling religions and become controlled by ideology. They leave corporate life and become enslaved to spiritual performance. They reject mainstream narratives and become addicted to oppositional identity. They flee one matrix and construct another. Why? Because the core mechanism of misidentification remains intact, and this changes everything. The true battlefield is not simply between you and the world. It is between direct awareness and the false center that keeps trying to narrate reality on its own terms. So what does escape begin to look like? Not dramatic at first. Often it begins as a quiet refusal. Refusal to let every thought define you. Refusal to let every fear become a worldview. Refusal to let social comparison determine your value. Refusal to let busyness replace being. Refusal to call distraction freedom. Refusal to reduce yourself to biography, profession, trauma, desire, or audience response. In a culture that constantly externalizes identity, inner stillness becomes an act of rebellion. Not performative stillness, not aesthetic stillness, real stillness. The kind that exposes how noisy the mind has become and how dependent the self is on movement. When people first encounter that silence, many misunderstand it. They expect immediate bliss. Often what comes first is discomfort, restlessness, emotional residue, mental chatter so loud it becomes almost humiliating. Why? Because silence interrupts the reinforcement loops that keep identity stable. Suddenly, you are no longer feeding the narrative self with constant stimulation. Everything unfinished begins rising. But that exposure is not failure. It is evidence. It reveals how much of ordinary life is structured around avoidance. The one who cannot sit quietly without reaching for input is already being ruled by something. The old Gnostics understood that awakening required discernment, not mere sincerity. It is not enough to want truth in a vague emotional sense. You must learn to distinguish between what in you seeks truth and what in you seeks comfort, image, power, or specialness through the language of truth. This is a brutal but freeing discipline. You start noticing which impulses contract and which clarify, which thoughts are reactive performances and which arise from stillness, which desires deepen your dependence and which strip illusion away. Discernment is not moralism. It is pattern recognition. It is how the soul stops confusing intensity with truth. But here's the part most people miss. Gnosis is not self-hatred. It is not the destruction of the person. It is the reordering of identity so the person is no longer mistaken for the deepest reality. That matters because some people hear teachings about ego and illusion and become hostile to their own humanity. They try to bypass emotion, bypass relationship, bypass embodiment, bypass grief, bypass vulnerability, as if transcendence means becoming less human. But the Gnostic insight is subtler. The problem is not that you have a personality, a history, a body, or emotions. The problem is that you have been conditioned to treat these as final. Liberation does not require despising the human instrument. It requires ceasing to worship it as the whole self. The body becomes a vehicle, not an identity. Emotion becomes information, not destiny. Thought becomes a tool, not a throne. This is why compassion matters more than people assume. Not sentimental compassion that flatters the ego as a rescuer, but the deeper compassion that arises when you realize nearly everyone is acting from confusion they mistake for selfhood. The person chasing status. The person clinging to ideology. The person performing certainty. The person numbing with distraction. The person attacking what they do not understand. In the Gnostic frame, these are not just moral failures. They are symptoms of entrapment. That does not remove responsibility, but it changes the texture of judgment. Once you see the machinery, hatred becomes less compelling than clarity. And now the tension sharpens again, because recognizing the prison does not automatically free you from it. In some ways, it raises the stakes. Once you can see how identity is manipulated, how desire is harvested, how fear is monetized, how attention is colonized, You can no longer innocently participate the way you did before. You start noticing the cost of every compromise, the cost of betraying your own direct knowing to maintain belonging, the cost of using distraction to avoid the deeper question, the cost of treating your life as a project when your soul is asking for presence. This stage can feel lonely because so much of normal social life depends on mutual agreement not to look too closely. Modern culture is especially hostile to this kind of seeing because it rewards legibility over essence. It wants you categorized, trackable, optimizable, emotionally predictable. The system does not care who you truly are. It cares whether you can be integrated into economic, social, and symbolic flows. That is why your deepest interiority has almost no market value. The part of you that can sit in silence, recognize illusion, resist comparison, and refuse false urgency cannot be easily monetized. From the perspective of the machine, that kind of consciousness is inefficient. From the perspective of the soul, it is the beginning of freedom. This is where it gets dangerous. Because a human being who begins to access inner authority threatens not only institutions, but the entire emotional economy of the false world. If you no longer need external validation to feel real, marketing loses power. If you no longer believe fear and urgency are the basic structure of life, control mechanisms weaken. If you no longer identify with every thought and role, ideology loses its grip. If you no longer seek completion through endless consumption, the system loses a customer at the level of desire itself. This is why genuine awakening is never just personal wellness. It carries existential implications. It changes how you work, choose, relate, speak, consume, obey, and resist. The false world can tolerate endless critique as long as the critic remains psychologically dependent on the same structures. What it cannot easily absorb is a consciousness that has withdrawn its worship, and that points toward the deeper revelation forming beneath the story. The human soul may not be here merely to survive the prison, but to expose it by remembering what cannot be manufactured inside it. This is where Sophia returns with a new meaning. Her gift was not only the divine spark, but the possibility that illusion can be recognized from within. The prison contains the seed of its own unraveling. The Demiurge builds a closed system, but the spark is not native to closure. It carries another logic, another memory, another taste for what is real. That is why no amount of conditioning fully works. Something in people keeps breaking script. Something keeps longing beyond explanation. Something keeps refusing to believe that the visible world is the whole story. This is the deeper surprise. Your dissatisfaction may not be a defect to fix. It may be evidence of contact with a level of being that cannot be domesticated by the world you inherited. That does not mean every restless impulse is sacred. Many are just egoic agitation. But beneath the noise, there is another form of unrest, one that does not crave novelty so much as truth. It is quieter, more exacting, less dramatic. It does not want a more impressive identity. It wants to stop pretending. It does not want to collect better beliefs. It wants to see. It does not want transcendence as escape fantasy. It wants reality without distortion. When that impulse awakens, life starts reorganizing around it whether you planned for it or not. So the path forward is not about adopting Gnosticism as another conceptual system and wearing it like a secret badge. That would just be another costume for the false self. The path is more severe and more intimate. To observe the mind without obeying it. To notice where fear writes your identity. To recognize how often desire is really displaced homesickness. To feel how much of modern anxiety comes from serving false gods named productivity, visibility, certainty, and control. To learn the difference between the voice that performs and the voice that knows. To let silence become more authoritative than noise. To discover whether there is an awareness in you that remains present before thought, during emotion, beneath biography, beyond image, not as theory, as direct encounter. If that awareness is real, even in glimpses, then the entire structure of life begins to change. Death looks different. Failure looks different. Success looks different. Time loosens, comparison weakens, the social mask becomes more transparent, the need to constantly explain yourself starts to fade. You do not become passive, you become less available to manipulation. You can still act, create, love, build, mourn, speak, and participate, but something fundamental is no longer for sale. The center has shifted, and this changes everything. Because the moment the center shifts, the Demiurge is no longer the unquestioned author of your reality. Still, one final tension remains. If the divine spark is already within, why does awakening feel so rare? Why do people glimpse truth and then fall back asleep? Why does remembering seem harder than forgetting? The answer may be more unsettling than comforting, because the system is not only external and psychological, it is habitual. It is inherited through culture, family, language, institutions, trauma, media, desire, and repetition. People do not wake once and stay awake by accident. They are pulled back toward forgetfulness, because forgetfulness is socially reinforced every hour of the day. To remember in such a world requires more than inspiration. It requires practice, courage, and a willingness to lose versions of yourself that once felt necessary. That is why the old texts speak in terms of passage, gates, testing, and inner knowledge. Whether or not you interpret those images literally, the principle remains powerful. Consciousness is challenged at every layer by what it still clings to. Fear, image, guilt, ambition, emotional dependency, intellectual vanity, nostalgia for the familiar self. These are the gates, not just after death. Now, in ordinary life. Every day asks the same question in a different form. What in you can be manipulated, and what in you cannot? Where are you still identified, and where have you remembered? The answer cannot be borrowed. No teacher can hand it to you. No ideology can secure it. No institution can certify it. The moment truth becomes fully externalized again, the archonic pattern quietly returns. That is why the final movement of this story cannot be total explanation. It has to become confrontation. Not with the world first, but with the place in you that still wants the world to tell you what is real. The place that still wants permission, still wants guarantees, still wants the prison to become comfortable rather than false. But here's the part most people miss. The reason this teaching feels dangerous is because some part of you already recognizes it. Not necessarily as doctrine, not as cosmology, but as a pressure inside your own life. The pressure that appears when the performance no longer satisfies, when your online self feels thinner than your silence, when success fails to answer the question that pain raised, when distraction starts feeling like self-erasure, when you realize your anxiety is not only chemical or circumstantial, but existential, when your longing stops asking for a better object and starts asking for a truer reality. Those moments are not random. They may be the beginning of remembrance, and if remembrance is real, then the world you were taught to trust as ultimate may only be the surface layer of a deeper conflict. Not a war of good people versus bad people. A war between recognition and misidentification. Between the spark and the structure built to contain it. Between the voice in you that says, become someone, prove yourself, secure your image, fear the clock, obey the script, and the quieter presence that says none of that is what you are. So maybe the real question is not whether the Demiurge exists as a being somewhere beyond the stars. Maybe the more urgent question is this. When you strip away the fear, the conditioning, the roles, the performance, the inherited beliefs, the endless reflex to seek yourself in things that cannot hold you, what remains? What in you was never fully captured? What in you keeps surviving every attempt to reduce life to productivity, personality, or flesh? What in you still knows, beneath all the noise, that this world is not the whole story? What you've just heard isn't really a story about a false god or a broken universe. It's a mirror, a way of seeing that the problem was never just out there in some distant cosmic structure. It's in the way reality is filtered, in the way identity is constructed, and in the way you've been trained to distrust your own direct awareness. The Demiurge is not just a creator, it's a pattern. And the moment you see that pattern clearly, even once, something in you stops playing along the same way. Because this is about you. That quiet feeling you've carried your whole life, the sense that something doesn't add up, that you're moving through a script you didn't write, that even your own thoughts sometimes feel inherited. That's not confusion. That is the friction between what you are and what you were conditioned to believe you are. And once you feel that clearly, you can't fully go back to sleep. Here's the deeper shift. Maybe awakening is not about escaping a fake world. Maybe it is about realizing that what you truly are was never fully contained by it to begin with. And if that's true, then the real illusion isn't just the world around you, it's the version of yourself you've been defending this entire time. So ask yourself this, and don't answer it too quickly. If everything you've called me was shaped inside a system you're only now beginning to question, then who is the one noticing that? Maybe the most dangerous thing about this world is not that it can hurt you, but that it can make you forget what you are before it ever needs to. If this made you pause, even for a second, stay with that. Maybe comment the word remember if something clicked for you. And if you want to go deeper into this, you already know what to do.